How does a republic that lasts for 500 years just vanish? Today, we're diving into one of history's great collapses, Rome's incredible transformation from a republic of citizens into an empire ruled by just one man.
And this is the real paradox at the heart of our story. I mean, think about it. Rome faced its most terrifying enemy, a man who brought it right to the brink of total annihilation, and it survived. But that very victory planted the seeds of the Republic's own destruction. So the real question is, how on earth did winning the war ultimately lead to losing the Republic?
All right, so to really get how Rome fell, you've got to go back to its greatest test, the Second Punic War. And at the center of that whole conflict was one man who would become an absolute legend of military history, Hannibal Barca of Carthage. See, Rome was a land power. Carthage was a sea power. The Romans were expecting a fight on the water, or maybe over in Spain. What they never imagined, not in a million years, was that an enemy army would do the impossible, marching tens of thousands of soldiers and, yes, war elephants over the frozen, treacherous Alps. So when Hannibal just appeared in Italy, it was a strategic shock that completely shattered every single Roman plan.
And this all leads to the Battle of Cannae, which was, no exaggeration, Rome's darkest day. Hannibal's tactic here was just a work of devastating genius. He put his weakest troops right in the center, almost daring the overconfident Romans to charge. And they did, but it was a trap. As the Romans pushed forward, Hannibal's stronger forces on the sides swung inward, kind of like a pair of pincers, and his cavalry looped all the way around to close the trap from behind. The Roman army was completely, utterly surrounded.
The result was a slaughter on a scale that's hard to even wrap your head around. Up to 70,000 Roman soldiers killed in a single day. Back in the city of Rome, when the news arrived, it was met with this stunned, terrified silence. For the very first time, people started whispering that Rome itself could actually fall. So with that kind of defeat, you'd think it's game over, right? And yet, Rome didn't fall. For one, Hannibal's army, even in victory, was exhausted and didn't have the right equipment for a long siege. Plus, his main goal wasn't really to level the city, but to break its alliances, to prove Rome couldn't protect its friends. But here's where he miscalculated. Most of Rome's allies stayed surprisingly loyal, and that incredible resilience is what allowed the Republic to survive. So Rome did fight back. Under a new general named Scipio, they took the fight all the way to Carthage and finally defeated Hannibal. Rome was now the undisputed master of the Mediterranean. But that victory, it came with a seriously poisonous price tag. Those long, brutal wars had changed Roman society forever, and really not for the better. And if you want to see what that price really was, just look at what happened to the absolute backbone of the Republic, the small farmer. Before the wars, this guy was a citizen soldier. He fought for his own land, his own family. But after being away at war for years, he'd come home to find his farm totally ruined, or bought up for pennies by the wealthy elite who'd stayed behind. He had no choice but to pack up and move to the city, totally landless and jobless. And these new mega farms, they had a name, latifundia. They were powered by this huge influx of slaves that Rome captured in its wars. Now, this system was brutally efficient, yeah, but it completely destroyed the traditional Roman middle class. What you got instead was this massive, unbridgeable gap between the super rich and the desperately poor. And this led to maybe the most dangerous change of all. With the citizen farmer gone, the army had to turn professional. All of a sudden, soldiers weren't fighting for their land or for the abstract idea of the state anymore. They were fighting for pay and for the generals who promised them land and riches. So a soldier's loyalty? It wasn't to the Republic, it was to his commander. This created private armies, and that is a perfect recipe for a civil war. Now, a couple of guys, two brothers from a really noble family, were some of the first to see this crisis unfolding and actually try to fix it. Their names were Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. They saw the danger of having a huge, landless citizenry and tried to push through reforms. Their story tragically marks the exact moment when Roman politics turned from debate to pure bloodshed. And this quote from Tiberius, man, it just cuts right to the heart of the whole problem. He saw that the Republic was losing its very identity. So he proposed a pretty simple law. Let's redistribute public land from the wealthy elite back to the poor. He was trying to bring back the citizen soldier, but the rich senators saw it as a direct attack on their wealth and their power. And the Senate's response? It was completely unprecedented and brutal. In 133 BC, a mob of senators and their thugs literally clubbed Tiberius Gracchus to death in public. A decade later, his brother Gaius met a similar end. This was a first. Political arguments in Rome were now being settled not with laws, but with murder. A terrible new line had been crossed.
So you've got this new normal of political violence, and you've got these private armies loyal to individual men. Well, that whole mess leads us straight to one person who was the ultimate product of this totally broken system. A brilliant general with a fiercely loyal army and just immense personal ambition. Gaius Julius Caesar.
Okay, so by 49 BC, Caesar is this massive national hero. He's just conquered all of Gaul, what we'd call France today. But his political enemies back in the Senate, terrified of his power, ordered him to break up his army and come home as a private citizen. They knew this would leave him totally vulnerable. So Caesar is standing at a small river in northern Italy, the Rubicon, which marked the legal boundary of Rome. To cross it with his army, that was treason. That was declaring war on your own country.
His decision? Well, it's become the stuff of legend. He supposedly uttered the famous words, "Alia jacta est," the die is cast, and he led his army across the river. The civil war for the soul of Rome had begun. There was no turning back now.
So Caesar wins the war. He returns to Rome not as a general, but as its absolute master. He's made dictator for life, which basically ended the whole idea of collective rule that the Republic was built on. Now, a lot of his reforms were popular, but he completely ignored the Senate and all the old traditions. So a group of senators, convinced he wanted to be a king, decided the only way to save the Republic was to kill the dictator.
Here's the twist, though. Killing Caesar didn't save the Republic. Not even close. It just kicked off another round of brutal civil wars. And out of all that chaos rose Caesar's young and pretty unassuming heir, his grandnephew Octavian. And he would succeed where Caesar failed, by using a much more subtle and brilliant strategy.
You know, the assassins, guys like Brutus, they honestly thought the people of Rome would hail them as liberators. They could not have been more wrong. At Caesar's funeral, his loyal general Mark Antony gave this masterful speech that completely turned the public against him. The dream of restoring the old republic basically died in the riots that followed that speech.
So, after years more of war, Octavian is the last man standing. But he'd been paying attention. He learned from his great-uncle's massive, fatal mistake. Where Caesar was fast and disruptive, Octavian was slow and methodical. Caesar grabbed the title dictator for life. Octavian made a big show of following the rules, or at least pretending to.
So in 27 BC, Octavian pulls off this incredible political performance. He goes to the Senate and makes a big show of returning all his power back to them. And in gratitude, they gave him a new name, Augustus, the revered one. But he insisted on being called only Princeps, which just means first citizen. It was a political masterstroke. He wasn't a king, he wasn't a dictator, he was just the most important guy in the room, working for the good of Rome.
And that's it. That's the final brilliant illusion. On the surface, the Republic looked like it was still there. The Senate still met, they still held elections. But in reality, Augustus held all the real power. He commanded the armies, he controlled the money, and his word was final. He had created the Roman Empire by pretending that he hadn't.
So in the end, Rome, after a century of bloody civil war, chaos, and constant instability, it made a choice. It chose the stability and order that one-man rule could offer over the violent, chaotic freedom of the late Republic. And that leaves us with a final, kind of haunting question. Is that a choice that all republics, in their own way, eventually have to face?